Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to talk about the demands that Putin has made to Ukraine in return for ending the war. Now I've read about these demands through the BBC website and I provided the link to that article in the video description below. So you might be reading that and thinking, what does this all mean? What can Ukraine do? What can Russia do? If only there was some kind of negotiation expert that perhaps could explain this. Well, have no fear. I shall do exactly that. And I shall only do it at a very high level. Obviously, these sorts of negotiations are subject to a lot of detail. And of course, I'm not privy to the detail, nor do I really want to talk too much about the detail in a video, otherwise it'll make it long and boring. But what I do want to do is try and summarise some of the key issues which perhaps haven't been summarised by news reporters because they're not professional negotiators, they don't know how to explain these things, and that is what I am going to use this channel for. So for anyone new to this channel, I am the Collaborative Negotiator. I'm a professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience, handling all sorts of big and complicated negotiations. And yes, they don't come any bigger than this, I guess. Ending a war is about as big a negotiation, there's a huge amount of pressure as any negotiator can get. So let's dive into it and let's do a little bit of analysis. So first, this is my take from the article on what is stated that Putin has demanded from Ukraine. So he had demanded a commitment to neutrality. No surprise. He demanded Ukraine will not join NATO. Again, no surprise. He has demanded disarmament, which to ask for a country that you have just invaded is somewhat cheeky. He's also demanded denazification, which is a little bit bogus, shall we say. In addition to those four core demands, he has also asked for face-to-face negotiations with President Zelensky to talk about the Crimea, Donbass and Luhansk. So that's been widely interpreted as he wants to annex or recognise independence of those territories, and so obviously that will take more stubborn negotiation, shall we say. And President Zelensky has already said he is willing to have face-to-face types of negotiation. Now I do take a little bit of exception to the article that I've linked to because it says that the Turkish opinion is that the first four demands are not too difficult and the final one, the extras will be the plus bit. I'm not so convinced of that personally, and I'll run through that. The first one I think actually isn't too difficult. That is one that they can reach a compromise on. I think Ukraine can look to the likes of Sweden and Finland and see that neutrality has actually worked quite well for them. So I think that is a position that Ukraine might be willing to compromise on, to adopt. The next one, they won't join NATO. This will be a difficult one for them. They want those security guarantees. NATO is the organisation that could provide that. However, of course, that is not guaranteed. There's no guarantee, for example, that NATO would agree to Ukrainian requests, notwithstanding the support currently being given to Ukraine. And there is no doubt that this would be a significant source of tension and future conflict with Russia, never mind what is going on at the moment. So I think this is one that is also open to compromise on the Ukrainian side. And I'll talk a little bit more about that further on and what they might do in parallel. The third one, I don't think is particularly feasible, personally. If I was in Ukraine's position, I would absolutely not want to agree to any kind of full disarmament. This is a demand that you make when you're winning or have won the war. Putin is not winning the war. Therefore, I don't really see how he can make this demand with a realistic expectation of it being implemented. However, there is some scope for certain compromises, perhaps. And speculating a bit here, Ukraine can perhaps make the assurance to Russia that Ukraine will not buy cruise or ballistic missiles, for example, And what that means is that Ukraine will then will not have long-range strike capability that can threaten Russia. So that means Ukraine can buy everything or be armed with everything that it requires for defense, but not necessarily be armed with equipment that it can use for offense. And maybe this is where compromise can be reached between Russia and Ukraine. But I would be very surprised if Ukraine would agree to full disarmament, especially considering what Russia has just done. Now the fourth one is a little bit interesting. It's actually going to be the easiest, I think, to agree to, weirdly enough. And that's because it's a bogus claim. Putin needs this simply to justify what he has done, to go back to the Russian people and say, I've secured this massive concession, this massive thing that, is morally right, shall we say. And of course, we all know that President Zelensky himself is Jewish. So I can't imagine at all that him objecting to not wanting Nazis in the country. So this would be an easy concession for him to make, in turn that he might create anti-Nazi laws that can be embedded into Ukraine, and that can be a visible demonstration of him meeting Putin's demand, that face-saving demand there, at minimal cost to him. And of course, we've then got the status of the regions. Some people have said that this may be a fait accompli. Russia has already taken Crimea and cemented its control over that region, and it can be seen it's extremely difficult for Ukraine to get that back. I don't know. This would be difficult, no doubt about it. It would be very difficult for Ukraine to agree demands in this area. But I think there's a little bit more to talk about here, rather than just accepting the status quo, and I'll come on to that. So, calling the shots. Do you think so? Do you think Putin is calling the shots? Or do you think he's actually trying to negotiate from a position of weakness? There's two things I want to say here. One is, his demands are like someone who has won, and he hasn't won. So it's very hard for him to sustain those demands. And so really, that means that he needs a quick win. He needs to agree, Ukraine to agree to these demands quickly. The longer it goes on, the less feasible those demands are. The other thing to also bear in mind, and I think I was struck by watching Putin earlier today when he was giving a speech in the stadium to a rapturous crowd of Russians. And what it reminded me of was 1930s Germany and the Nuremberg gatherings. Now, for the American audience, if I do have any, I know I do have some, what you should remember, and this is more familiar in America, it is very much less of a thing in Europe. Europe did not like seeing those big types of gatherings and rallies, especially not in a political context. For us, that is too much of a reminder of the build-up of the Nazi Party and Hitler, who gave his famously impassioned speeches to the German people. What Putin did today is eerily reminiscent of that time, a time that fills many Europeans, and that includes Britain, with dread. Now the Americans perhaps don't have that history. They're perhaps more willing to have big political rallies with lots of shouting and cheering and that sort of stuff. But they should understand that for Europe, just seeing even American ones is not actually very comfortable. For us, there is that reminder. And so Putin has done that. He has portrayed himself in that way, with the propaganda, with the adulation, with the rhetoric. And so what that means is that he doesn't actually have much to offer when it comes to negotiation. What he has is more violence. That is what's on the table, and he's disguising that in the way, and he's justifying it to the Russian people. That's the whole point of that big rally, to justify what he is doing. But to anybody else, all he offers is violence, and he has no other bargaining cards. And even nuclear weapons are just an increased escalation of violence. So his main way of getting concessions from Ukraine is simply to pour more troops in, to destroy more cities, to kill more citizens, and to keep on going. That is all he has to offer. He has nothing else. So he doesn't look good to anyone outside of Russia. Obviously inside of Russia, possibly a different story. But outside of Russia, he doesn't look like someone in a strong position. Moreover, because he doesn't look like a winning, and because he looks like the next the Hitler on the rise, no one's going to want to agree to anything because it looks too much like appeasement. And I've talked about that in previous videos. When someone is behaving that badly and making that unreasonable demands, then you know that compromise is a dangerous thing. Compromise is something you can do when the other side are genuine, are reasonable. And even former Russian prime ministers, who was interviewed on American news recently actually, voiced the opinion that Putin's demands are not genuine, far less that they're reasonable. And so Ukraine is in a very difficult position here. They're having to meet demands from a very unreasonable individual who offers the threat of extreme further violence to them. And the violence so far has been bad enough, but he is able to ratchet up that further. That is his negotiation card, as it were, to just keep on going, to be even more vile and more evil towards Ukraine. So within that context, many people might be forgiven for thinking that Ukraine is a bit screwed. They're a bit stuck as the junior negotiating partner, shall we say. Well, not so fast on that front. I think there's a few bargaining chips that Ukraine can play. And they won't be easy choices for them. But their negotiators will no doubt be thinking about this, and it will form part of how they negotiate with Putin. For starters, the longer this conflict goes on, the more Ukraine can bleed Russia. And this is the thing to remember. Russia right now has the 11th largest economy in the world. It certainly doesn't have the largest military in the world, although it has a reasonably well-funded one and a reasonably large one. And of course, when stacked up against Ukraine, it does look overwhelming. But behind Ukraine is the whole of Europe, the whole of the US, and more nations beside. So even though Ukraine itself cannot match Russia for military power or economic power, it has an awful lot of allies that very much overwhelm Russia, particularly on the supply of weapons. So no matter what the Russians do, whether they take Kiev, whether they take more major cities, Ukraine can possibly count on a very steady supply of weaponry. They can make further conflict extremely costly for Putin and for Russia. All they have to do is maintain the will to fight, to maintain that high motivation, the high morale that they've currently got. And in that context, Russia has no chance whatsoever. It can take cities, it can flatten cities, it can even make small gains, but it simply cannot sustain that against what Ukraine has behind it in terms of support. So this is one of the things that Ukraine can do to strengthen its position, and I've talked about this before, is play for time. And of course, that is not going to be pleasant for Ukraine. More people will die. But then losing half your country to a dictator is no kind of deal at all after either. So they can continue to fight. That is how they can negotiate, to bleed Russia, to reduce those demands that Putin has made, to make it more obvious that he is not winning and those demands are not sustainable. They can also make counter demands. And surely they would be in a good position right now to demand reparations from Russia for all the damage that has been caused to its cities. No doubt Putin will refuse, but again, Putin is suffering horribly in terms of costs. So strictly speaking, he might be in a position of making a cost-benefit analysis that says that paying Ukraine reparations would be far less costly than continuing the war, particularly if Ukraine are willing to agree to most of his demands in return. for those reparations. And those reparations don't have to be a massive, loss of face, chunk of cash. They could be some preferential rates on the supply of gas, for example. Ukraine gets lots of, revenue from the gas pipeline. They can use that as part of, you will pay us extra for this gas pipeline as a form of reparations. That might be one of their demands. It'd be worth making, I would say. They should also most definitely demand security guarantees. If Putin wants Ukraine to disarm and not to join NATO, then Ukraine needs to find ways to counter that and to tell Putin, well, we don't trust you, you've just invaded us, so how are you going to guarantee our security that this doesn't happen again? They absolutely should make that sort of demand, that counter proposal or counter demand back to Putin and force him to explain, to justify, and to say, what he will do to benefit Ukraine. Because nothing he has offered so far actually benefits Ukraine. It takes everything away from Ukraine. So that is a little bit how you reach a compromise, is that you demand that someone gives you something back in return. And right now, Putin is offering nothing back in return. And I've saved the best for last, really. Because many people think that Ukraine is the underdog. And for a pretty feisty underdog, they're doing pretty well. Not only militarily, but in terms of the propaganda war, in terms of support, in terms of the information war. And people on Ukraine's side, they are not on Russia's side. Even countries like China is only supporting Russia, if they are, reluctantly. They're not particularly keen on this, and they certainly don't like what Russia is doing to Ukraine. And Ukraine can use that. So if Ukraine is negotiating with Putin, then, and if Zelensky, let's say, he has this face-to-face negotiation with Putin, now one of the things Zelensky should do is use his current popularity to make a proposal to the EU and to the US, for example, and to ask them that no matter what compromises he has to reach with Russia, with Putin specifically, that they need to maintain their position, particularly that on sanction. So what I mean by that is that if Zelensky is refusing to give up Donbass and Crimea, for example, and Luhansk, if he can get the US and the EU to make it very clear to Russia that no matter what agreement or what concessions Putin demands from Zelensky, if Russia continues to hold those regions, then the EU, the US and the international community at large will maintain those crippling sanctions on Russia until Russia pulls out. And at which point Putin has a massive problem. He is no longer negotiating against Zelensky. He is now negotiating against Zelensky, who has the backing of the rest of the world behind him. And no matter what concessions he grabs from Zelensky, with the threat of more violence, he will continue to suffer even after any kind of peace agreement is reached. That is a trump card that Zelensky can play to really, really undermine Putin's ability to enforce these demands. Because what's the point of holding Crimea and having two independent Russian-aligned republics if your economy is going completely in the toilet because all the other nations will maintain sanctions against you? Putin doesn't just need Ukraine to agree to his demands. He needs those sanctions to stop as well. And if Zelensky is able to exploit his friendship, his popularity with the other world leaders to maintain those sanctions no matter what, then Putin's hand, such as it is massively reduced. He has big problems and he will know it. This is why I always argue in negotiations that if you are in a weaker position, one of the best ways of strengthening your position is to come at the problem from a different angle. And if you've got friends, those are the angles that can really apply significant leverage that supports your negotiations. So what conclusions can we draw going forward? And obviously the negotiations are ongoing, and of course I don't know what the outcome will be. I can only speculate. But the conclusions I would draw are that time is not on Putin's side. He needs those sanctions to end. He needs the conflict to end. He needs to stop losing most of his military at this point in time. And he needs to be able to present some kind of victory to his people, even if it's a fake one. And he needs to do that quickly. The longer the conflict goes on, the much harder it will be for him to achieve those aims, and the worse the scenario in Russia will become. So he needs to agree things quickly. He needs to force concessions from Ukraine quickly. And maybe he'll do that with extreme violence. And that is the significant concern that people have. So this puts Ukraine, of course, in a very difficult situation. They have to balance taking more loss, taking more bombs and shells being leveled in their country, or continuing to fight to strengthen their position. Because there's no doubt in my mind that they can strengthen their position. They can counter all of Putin's demands with demands of their own, and possibly even force concessions from him. But he won't agree to them quickly, and he will need to be forced to feel the pressure. And finally, and I maintain this conclusion, which I've had for a long time, Russia has already lost this war. It's already lost this conflict. No matter what the outcome is, no matter if they do gain territory, they have lost. The damage that will happen to their military and to their economic power is enormous, and that will last for a very long time. So the question is not really whether Russia has lost, that's a given. It's whether Putin has lost, whether he's overreached so much that the Russian people themselves will, come to their own conclusion that he cannot stay in power. That is the one question that I think there is in my mind. Has he maintained his position? Has he strengthened even, perhaps, his position in Russia? Sometimes that happens in a dictatorial type society. When you control the news, conflicts can be used to strengthen your position, even if you actually lose in the darn conflict. So that is the main question in my mind, is whether Putin is losing, not whether Russia is losing, because Russia had basically lost. So I hope you found this bit of negotiation analysis useful and insightful. I shall look forward to the comments below the video, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this.